Dear brave souls and broken-hearted souls, welcome to Wild West Epic, where guns fall silent and scars become vows. If you believe that love can rise from the ashes, that second chances are real, then you've come to the right place, my friend. Hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and share this story with a friend, because the story you're about to hear is unlike anything you've ever seen before. It begins with a whisper, a chilling plea on the arid soil of the Texas Hill Country. It was spring 1865, the Texas Hill Country, just 2 weeks after the guns of the Civil War had fallen silent. The morning sun had not yet penetrated the thick canopy of the cottonwoods, only faint rays of light filtering down, glittering like gold dust. A small stream trickled over moss-covered rocks, strangely peaceful, but in the stillness, Elias Gray, a Confederate veteran, sensed something was wrong. His horse, a tired old gelding named Rufus, stopped suddenly by the stream, ears erect, breathing heavily. Elias dismounted slowly, his hand sliding over the revolver at his belt. His boots sank lightly into the wet ground as he stepped into the narrow stream. And that's when he saw her, a young girl, just a shadow of a woman. She lay curled up near the water's edge, one leg twisted behind her, the other bare from the knee down. Her dress was torn, covered in mud and blood, and her hands were scratched as if she had dragged herself here with her fingernails. Elias dropped to one knee. "Miss?" he called softly. There was no answer. He bent down, checking her breathing. Her chest rose and fell, slowly, trembling. Her skin was cold under the dirt, and there was a long, bright red gash across her thigh. Elias pulled a piece of cloth from his saddlebag and tore it in half. He carefully reached toward her feet, trying not to startle her. But as he touched her skirt to pull it up over the wound, her body jerked. Her eyes widened, wild. "No!" she screamed, her voice breaking. "No! Please! Kill me quickly!" Elias froze, his hand hovering inches from hers. Her eyes locked on his. She wasn't just scared, she was surrendered. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said softly. "Just do it," she whispered. "I don't want to feel it." He blinked. Slowly, he withdrew his hand. "I'm not going to kill anyone today," he said. "You're bleeding. I'm going to help you, that's all." With the utmost care, he approached her leg again. "Let me see," he said. "This wound needs cleaning." This time she didn't protest, but her jaw clenched and she turned away. He gently pulled the torn dress up from her knees, and he froze. There, imprinted on the soft skin of her inner thigh, was a scar. A single word. Red. Permanent. A horror Elias had seen before. He had seen similar scars only once, near the end of the war, when his unit stumbled upon a makeshift slave camp on the outskirts of Monroe. All women. Some alive. Some dead. And they all carry that same mark. His hands balled into fists before he stilled them. He looked back at the girl. She wasn't crying. She didn't even blink. Her face had become as blank as a drawn curtain. "What is your name?" he asked softly. She did not say. "I'm Elias. Elias Gray. You're safe now." He wrapped the cloth around her thigh carefully, conscious of every twitch. Blood soaked into the cloth quickly, but the pressure helped. "I'm going to get you out of here," he said. Her eyes slowly closed again, too exhausted to fight. Elias wrapped his coat around her and gently lifted her into his arms. "Whatever they did to you," he whispered as he lifted her toward Rufus, "it will end now." In the flames, and as he rode away from the stream, the scar beneath her skirt burned red in the morning sun, a silent testament to a story that had only just begun. The cabin was half hidden in a gnarled oak forest, just after a bend in the river. It was old and tilted slightly to the east, but it was dry, sheltered, and, for now, safe. Elias brought the girl inside and gently placed her on the blankets spread near the fireplace. The fire was out, but he quickly gathered wood and struck flint. Within minutes, the fire had breathed life back into the room. When Elias brought her warm water and a clean cloth, she started, shaking more than a stray dog. "I need to clean the wound," he said softly. "This is going to hurt." She nodded, almost imperceptibly. He worked in silence, gently cleaning her wound, never looking her straight in the eye when he had to lift her skirt, never touching her more than necessary. When he was done, he covered her legs with the blanket and stepped back. She still looked at him, not with curiosity, but with the wariness of a hunted animal, uncertain whether this new cage contained food or a knife. He moved to the stove, warmed a pot of beans with a little salt, and ladled some into a tin bowl. He let it cool before giving her the first spoonful. At first, she refused to take it, just stared. "Eat slowly," he said, his voice warm, not commanding. Finally, she opened her mouth. He fed her piece by piece, like a father feeding a wounded child. No words, no questions, just food, warmth, and fire. That night he slept in the far corner, his back against the wall, gun within reach. She didn't move once, but her eyes remained open all night. By morning, she was sitting up straight, leaning against a pillar. When he brought her water to wash her hands, she was startled and let him pour the water. On the third day, Elia sat next to her with an old comb and said, "If you will allow me, I can untangle this tangle for you." She hesitated, then slowly turned her back to him. He started at the top, gently, careful not to jerk. Her hair was matted with twigs, dried blood, and dirt. He worked silently, patiently, while the fire crackled nearby. Halfway through, she let out a long breath, and for the first time, her shoulders relaxed slightly. That afternoon, he took out a small oval mirror from his bag. It was scratched and dented, the kind of memento a soldier might carry around for nostalgic reasons. He placed it beside her on the stool. "Perhaps you would like to have a look," he said. "You look better than you think." She stared at the mirror for a long time. Then, in a sudden movement, she grabbed it and threw it into the stone fireplace. It shattered. Elias didn't move. Her voice rose. "I don't want to see her." He nodded slowly. "I understand. No lecture, no demand for an apology, just silence." That night, as he was spooning more beans into their bowls, she finally spoke again. "My name is Maeve." He looked over. "Maeve," he repeated, as if it were a sacred name. "That's all I can give you now." "That's more than I expected," he said. She let out a breath, half sigh, half laugh. They ate in silence. But something had changed, not in the room, but in the space between them. She didn't thank him. He didn't ask for it. But as she handed the bowl back, her fingers touched his hand for a moment, and she did not pull her hand away. The road into Bandera was quiet that morning, lined with juniper and dirt still damp from the night's rain. Elias rode slowly, Maeve sitting behind him in the saddle, her arms loosely around his waist. She hadn't said much since they left the hut, only nodding when he asked if she was strong enough to ride. They needed medicine. Her wound, though better, still ached, and Elias knew infection might set in if he didn't find more ointment and clean bandages. Bandera is a town struggling to survive, with rotting boards, shuttered saloons, and weary men bearing the burden of war on their shoulders. This was the kind of place where strangers would attract attention, and rumors would cling like flies to sweat. They dismounted near the grocery store. Elias gently helped Maeve down. "Stay close to the horse," he said. "I'll be quick." She nodded, pulling her scarf tighter. The moment he entered the store, her hands began to shake. She bowed her head, her eyes scanning every face that passed by. And then he appeared, a drunk, staggering out of the saloon. Huge arms, matted beard, coal eyes, and rotten breath. He bumped into her shoulder. "Careful," she muttered, barely audible. He turned, squinting, looking her up and down. Oh, he said. "Isn't she a familiar whore?" Maeve backed away, but he stepped closer. "Don't you remember me?" he hissed. "East Camp Monroe. Oh, I remember that mark." He rushed forward and tugged at the hem of her skirt. In the daylight, the word imprinted on her thigh was glowing red. The people around were startled. A woman covers her child's eyes. Someone whispered, "It's one of them." The man grinned, Runaway meat, Maeve frozen. But Elias was there. He pushed the man so hard that he fell backwards into the gutter. Before the drunk could get up, Elias punched him once, twice, 3 times until blood flowed from his nose. No one interfered. Elias took Maeve's hand. "Let's go." They rode out of Bandera without another word. Back at the hut, the silence was oppressive. Maeve sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Elias tried to speak, but she just shook her head. That night the rain returned, gently at first, then cold and heavy. Elias woke up with a start to find the blanket empty. He ran outside. She stood by the riverbank, barefoot on a slippery rock, her skirt stuck to her legs, her hair soaking wet, her eyes wide open. "Maeve," he called. She didn't turn back. "I can't live like this," she said. "They see me, and all they see is that word, that scar. Not a person, just something broken." "You're not broken," Elias said, stepping carefully toward her. "You survived." She shook her head. "You deserve someone whole. I want you," he said, his voice shaking, "and I won't let you disappear." He reached out as she stepped forward and grabbed her. The river was rushing by beneath them. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as the rain soaked them both. She clung to him, sobbing on his chest, and he said nothing, just held her for a long time, in the darkness, with only the storm as witness. The silence of the forest that morning was so still, even the birds seemed to hold their breath. Maeve had gotten up early to fetch water from the stream. Elias was still sleeping soundly, aching under the weight of his healing ribs. She was halfway back when she saw it. The front door was wide open, the blanket inside empty. There was no sign of a struggle, no sound, just him, gone. Her heart dropped. The world tilted. Then something caught her eye. A boot print, burned deep into the mud from last night's rain. At least 3 feet, heading west, into the woods. She dropped the bucket of water, ran inside, and grabbed the rifle leaning against the fireplace. Elias's revolver was still on the table, uncleaned, forgotten since the night before. She took it too, checked the chamber, 4 rounds. Slim chance. She followed the trail into the woods. Bare branches scratched at her hands, her breathing sharp and rapid. The tracks grew fresher, scuffed, scuffed. Her pace increased. An hour passed, then 2. Finally she heard it. A low, mocking voice rang out from the clearing ahead. Jonah Beeksley. She hid behind a tree, looking through the bushes. Elias was kneeling, hands tied behind his back, blood oozing from his temple. Beeksley paced back and forth before him, his shotgun slung low. 2 other men stood nearby, armed. "You think hiding it makes you a hero?" Beeksley spat. "It's just a scar, nothing more, nothing less. Do you really think it won't run away when it sees you crippled and broken like the rest of them?" Elias said nothing, his chin held high despite the bruises. Beeksley sneered. "Damn it, I owe you. You saved me from having to drag him back. Maybe I'll show you before I slit your throat." Maeve stepped into the space. "Take another step toward him," she said, her voice clear, "and I will kill you." The men turned. She stood there, her hair disheveled, her sleeves torn, mud on her boots, but her eyes steady, her gun raised, one breath away from pulling the trigger. Beeksley's smile faltered, then turned more grim than before. "Oh, good," he said. "That girl with the scar dares to show her teeth." He stepped forward. She didn't back down. "You're gonna shoot me, baby? After everything we've been through?" His voice turned to a growl. "Do you remember? The cell? The ropes? The way you cried when I—" The loud crack of a pistol tore through the morning. A single shot, straight into his chest. Beeksley staggered. Blood splattered on his waistcoat. He looked down, disbelieving, and fell back onto the ground. The other 2 men froze. One turned and ran. The other dropped his weapon and backed away, hands shaking. Maeve kept her gun raised until she was sure they were gone. Then she let it fall. Her knees buckled, and she fell beside Elias, her hands shaking violently. "I killed him," she whispered, staring at the blood. "I killed someone." Elias leaned toward her, though every breath was painful. "You saved my life." She shook her head, her eyes wild. "But what does that make me? What does it mean if I can do that? If I can pull a trigger like that?" He reached out, his bound hands touching her cheek. "It means you are stronger than what he did to you." She stared at him, tears in her eyes. "Aren't you afraid of me?" He held her gaze. "I have never been less afraid." A sob escaped her lips. "I thought if you saw me like that, you would see what he saw." Elias leaned closer, whispering in pain. "I didn't see what he saw. I saw the woman who came for me, the woman who went through hell and stood up to the devil." She bowed her head, pressing it against his shoulder, trembling with relief. "I thought I had lost you. You found me." Only then did she reach behind him, cut the ropes, and pull him into her arms. They stayed like that for a long time, surrounded by silence and fallen leaves. Maeve pulled the trigger, but for the first time, not in fear. It was in love and survival, and she had no regrets. The forge behind the hut was nothing more than a black stone pit and an old anvil. Elias pulled it up from the mountainside with a broken wheel and an iron will. There was no shelter from the wind, no roof, just the vast sky and the sound of hot metal screeching in the cold air. But it was enough. He stood there at dawn, sleeves rolled up, shirt drenched in sweat despite the morning chill, hammer clenched in calloused hands. Each hammer blow echoed across the void like a slow heartbeat. Maeve stood in the doorway of the hut, clad in one of Elias's old coats, her arms folded tightly across her chest. She didn't ask what he was doing, but her eyes were fixed on him, watching, listening, waiting. She could see the tension in his shoulders. The way he moved was like someone shaping not just metal, but meaning from the rubble, trying to craft something that would last forever. The shell casing had been in his bag since the last day of the war. One of the last bullets he loaded into the chamber in a chaos of fire and smoke. He never shot it. Something held him back. Maybe fate? He didn't know why he kept it. Maybe it reminded him of what he had survived. Or maybe it had always been waiting for this moment. He gently placed it in the fire until it glowed red, then pulled it out with an iron tongs and placed it on the anvil. The first blow flattened it with a metallic clang. The next shaped it, and then another, and another. He moved slowly, methodically, transforming the shell from a weapon into a ring, with rough edges, bronze from brass, and warm from fire. When it cooled, he filed it smooth, polishing it with a cloth and ash. No engravings, no gems, just the memory of heat and the promise of what comes after. By the time he finished, the sun was high above the pines. The air smelled of wildflowers and morning earth. Elias wiped his forehead, pocketed the ring, and turned back to face the open field. "Maeve," he called softly. She walked out, her coat still draped over her shoulders, her hair loose and tangled in the wind. He stood near the edge of the woods, where the fields gave way to tall grasses and colorful flowers, bluebonnets, Indian paintbrush, wild mustard that stretched for miles. Spring has finally come to Texas. She walked toward him, her bare feet brushing the dewy grass. He did not wait. He looked straight into her eyes, steady and certain, no fear in his voice. "I never thought I would survive that war," Elias said. "And after it was over, I didn't think there was anything left for me. I was passing through the world like a ghost." Maeve's throat tightened. "But I found you," he said. "Or maybe you found me." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the ring. It gleamed faintly in the sunlight. Plain, unpolished, forged by hand and memory. "This was a bullet," he said, his voice choked. "Now it's a promise." He knelt on one knee. "Maeve Carter, I know what they did to you. I know what they tried to take, but they didn't take your fire, your grace, or your soul." He looked up, eyes sparkling. "You gave me a reason to live, to fight for something real. Will you marry me? Will you build something with me that war cannot destroy?" Maeve stood still, her fingers trembling. She looked down at her hand, still scarred. and down at her leg, where the scar was still there. Then she looked at Elias. He wasn't looking at her scars. He was looking at her. The woman who had chosen to survive, to stay, to love. Tears welled up. She smiled. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." Elias put the ring on her finger. It was imperfect, forged from rubble, but it fit, as if it had always belonged to her. She pressed her hands to his face, and when she kissed him, it was more than love. It was survival. It was salvation. And out in that field of wildflowers under the big Texas sky, they both knew they had taken something that was meant to destroy them and turned it into something sacred. The sunset dyed the Texas hills a rose gold, casting long shadows over the small wooden chapel on the mountainside. The heat of the day has softened into a gentle warmth, one that touches your skin like a memory. The air smelled of honeysuckle and dust, and the wind whispered through the grass as if it too had come to witness something sacred. Inside the chapel, the pews were filled with townspeople, silent, curious, and uncertain. News of the wedding had spread like wildfire. Now they know her name. They know the scar she bears. They whispered about the scar, about the soldier who took her in, about the night she was seen buying bread alone, head bowed, about the morning she walked out of the doctor's office, holding Elias's hand. Some come for judgment, others come for guilt, for all the times they turned away, but most come for the story. The girl was branded, and the man never let her go. Then the door creaked open. Maeve stepped through. She wore a simple white dress, sewn by Elias with clumsy fingers, each seam pulled and reworked until it fit. The hem of the dress isn't perfect, a stitch here, a loose thread there, but it's beautiful in the way that only something that's been won over can be beautiful. Her hair was pinned back with wildflowers, bluebonnets, Queen Anne's lace, and a sprig of lavender behind her ear. Her eyes, once evasive and wary, now held a stillness, not the stillness of fear, but the stillness of one who has accepted being seen. She walked steadily, her back straight and her shoulders high. The scar on her thigh was visible under the slit of her dress. She did not hide it, and no one in that chapel turned away. A little girl scattered flower petals at her feet, smiling brightly. She didn't know the burden of what she was honoring, but somehow she carried it. The room held its breath. Then someone clapped. One person, then another, and another, until the whole room erupted in applause. Not for beauty, but for courage. Elias stood at the altar, clean-shaven for the first time in months. His shirt was pressed, and his boots were polished. His ribs still ached with every breath, but he stood straight. He had never looked more like a soldier, and less like a man in battle. His eyes never left her. When Maeve reached him, she smiled. "You did this," she whispered, barely audible. "You too," he replied just as softly. When it came time to recite the vows, Elias took Maeve's hand and turned to face the crowd. "I want you all to see her," he said. Not the scars, not the pain, not the past. He looked back at Maeve, his voice steady, certain. She is not the girl they tried to destroy. She is not the thing they tried to brand. She is a woman who survived, and she is not someone's property. She is someone's hope. Then gently, he slid the brass ring onto her finger. It was imperfect, forged from an old bullet casing, but it was hers, forged by fire, by choice, by love. Maeve blinked back tears. Her lips parted, but no words came out. No words needed, just breath, just love. When the pastor gave them permission, Elias kissed her slowly, carefully, reverently, and the chapel erupted. Cheers, applause, silent tears, whispers filled the air. Maybe Grace still lives in Texas. The Rasson. They walked out hand in hand into the setting sun, her dress fluttering in the wind, the scar visible like a flag that never lowered. Outlaws may have once ridden through these hills, but that day, another legend was written. Sunset paints the Texas hills in rose gold, casting long shadows over a small wooden chapel on the mountainside. The heat of the day has softened into a gentle warmth, one that touches your skin like a memory. The air smelled of honeysuckle and dust, The wind whispered through the grass as if it too had come to witness something sacred. Inside the chapel, the pews were filled with townspeople, silent, curious, and uncertain. News of the wedding spread like wildfire. Now, they know her name. They know the scar she carries. They whispered about the scar, about the soldier who had taken her in, about the nights she had been seen buying bread alone, head bowed, about the morning she had walked out of the doctor's office, holding Elias's hand. Some come for judgment, others come for guilt, but most come for the story. The girl was branded, and the man never let her go. Then the door creaked open. Maeve stepped through. She wore a simple white dress, sewn by Elias with clumsy fingers, each seam pulled and reworked until it fit. The hem of the dress isn't perfect. A stitch here, a loose thread there. But it's beautiful in the way that only something fought over can be beautiful. Her hair was pinned back with wildflowers, blue bonnets, Queen Anne's lace, and a sprig of lavender behind her ear. Queen Anne W. Do. Her eyes, once evasive and wary, now held a stillness. She walked steadily, her back straight, her shoulders high. A pasty. The scar on her thigh was visible under the slit of her dress. She did not hide it, and no one in that chapel turned away. As Maeve reached him, she smiled. "You did this," she whispered, barely audible. "You too," he replied, just as softly. When it came time to recite the vows, Elias took Maeve's hand and turned to face the crowd. "I want you all to see her," he said. "Not the scars, not the pain, not the past. She is not the girl they tried to destroy. She is not the thing they tried to stamp. She is the woman who survived, and she is not someone's property. She is someone's hope." Then gently, he placed the brass ring on her finger. It wasn't perfect, made from an old bullet casing, but it was hers, forged from fire, from choice, from love. When the pastor gave them permission, Elias kissed her slowly, carefully, reverently, and the chapel erupted. Cheers, applause, silent tears. They walked out hand in hand into the light of the setting sun. Outlaws may have once ridden these hills, but that day, it was a different kind of legend being written. If Elias and Maeve's story has touched you, if you believe that love can rise from scars and second chances, then you've come to the right place, my friend. Become part of the Wild West Epic family by hitting the subscribe button now. We create stories of courage, resilience, and love, where the true heroes are not those who never fall, but those who get up after being defeated. Please hit the like button. Share this story with your friends and family so we can inspire more people. And don't forget to leave a comment below, letting us know what you think of this epic story. Whether you believe you are marked by your past or not, remember that you are not your past. You are who you choose to be.